We picture Roman feasts flowing with golden wine, but the legions that conquered the ancient world drank something far more bitter and far more practical. Posca, a tart, sour mixture of watered-down vinegar, occasionally flavored with herbs, was the daily fuel of every Roman foot soldier from the 2nd century BC through the 3rd century AD. Roman vintners would let their cheapest wine turn completely to vinegar, then dilute it with water in roughly a 1:3 ratio, creating a drinkable sour beverage known as Posca. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated. The acetic acid in Posca acted as a natural antibacterial agent, making it significantly safer to drink than plain water on long campaigns. Cato the Elder, writing around 160 BC in his treatise De Agricultura, documented Posca production on his estates, proving this sour ration was already standard practice by the late Republic. Fine wine was expensive, a status symbol reserved for senators and the wealthy. Posca cost pennies. For an army of up to 300,000 active soldiers at any given time, cheap hydration was an empire-building necessity. Here's what's fascinating about Posca Roman soldier wine. The Gospel of Mark, written around 70 AD, records Roman soldiers offering Jesus a sponge soaked in Posca on the cross. A chilling detail that confirms Posca was so ubiquitous, it was assumed everyone knew what it was. When Mark Antony was offered a cup of fine wine by Caesar during their famous reconciliation at the Temple of Venus, Antony deliberately chose Posca instead, a quiet political statement about Roman toughness over luxury. Here's what's fascinating about Posca Roman soldier wine. Part 2. By the height of the empire under Emperor Trajan around 117 AD, each Roman cohort of 480 men received regular Posca rations, distributed by centurions as part of the daily camp routine alongside bread and salt. In the ancient world, vinegar wasn't waste, it was a preserved commodity. Wine that turned to vinegar retained value, and Posca represented the cleverest way to stretch a bad harvest into something drinkable and safe. Ancient sources describe Posca as sharp, acidic, and intensely sour, a drink that made your jaw ache. But for soldiers marching hundreds of miles across Europe and North Africa, that sour punch was refreshing in its own rough way. The agricultural writer Columella, in his 12-volume De Re Rustica written around 60 AD, advised that Posca should be made from the lowest quality wine, the dregs and lees, reinforcing that it was a drink of necessity, not choice. Here's what's fascinating about Posca Roman soldier wine. Part 3. From the humblest legionary to the most decorated centurion, Posca was the great Roman social equalizer, a drink that required no wealth, no connections, only the discipline to swallow something sour and keep marching. As the Western Roman Empire fractured in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the logistical system that sustained mass Posca production collapsed. The drink faded from military ration lists, replaced by whatever wine or water each surviving faction could scavenge. Today, Posca survives in language and memory. The Portuguese word Posca still means a weak alcoholic drink, and food historians debate whether the Roman military diet was the unseen foundation of the empire's 2-century dominance. Rome didn't conquer the Mediterranean on fine wine and olive oil. It conquered on vinegar, water, and the relentless discipline of soldiers who could sustain themselves on the sour stuff that would have made a patrician gag. Posca was more than a soldier's drink. It was the taste of Roman endurance, a sour reminder that empires are not built on luxury, but on the willingness of ordinary people to swallow something bitter and keep going. Posca wasn't fancy wine. It was vinegar, water, and herbs, and it kept Roman soldiers alive for 5 centuries across every climate the empire conquered. Acetic acid in vinegar kills E. coli, salmonella, and cholera bacteria on contact. In a world without germ theory, Posca was the closest thing ancient medicine ever produced. Roman camps drew water from rivers and wells that were little better than open sewers. Legionary latrines sat upstream. Drinking untreated water was a fast ticket to dysentery and death. Aulus Cornelius Celsus, writing around 30 AD in his 8-volume De Medicina, explicitly prescribed Posca for fever, dehydration, and digestive complaints, making it official Roman military medicine. Galen, the towering physician to gladiators and emperors, wrote in 177 AD that Posca strengthens the stomach and quenches thirst without the excesses of wine, essentially the original sports drink endorsement. Vinegar contains potassium, trace minerals, and acetic acid, which together form a natural electrolyte solution. Soldiers drinking Posca replaced salts lost through sweat far better than plain water ever could. A Roman legionary carried up to 45 kilograms of gear and could march 29 kilometers in a single day. Without Posca's hydration and mineral boost, campaign endurance would have collapsed within weeks. At the Battle of Adwa in 244 AD, Emperor Gordian III's army of 400,000, likely exaggerated, marched into Persian territory parched and disorganized. Posca rations ran out before the catastrophic defeat at Masish. When wine goes bad, it becomes vinegar, a natural fermentation that creates an environment where pathogens simply cannot survive. Roman soldiers weren't drinking spoiled wine. They were drinking a deliberately preserved, bactericidal beverage. The Roman military logistics system, known as the Annona, distributed Posca as a standard ration alongside grain and salt. Every legion, from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates, received Posca shipments through an organized supply chain. While common soldiers drank Posca, Roman officers preferred fine Falernian wine. But Posca was so respected that even the Emperor Commodus, dying in 192 AD, was reportedly given Posca by his assassins to dilute his strength. Posca appears in all 4 Gospels of the New Testament. When Jesus cried out on the cross around 30 to 33 AD, a Roman soldier offered him wine mixed with vinegar on a hyssop branch, a final, bitter Posca. Modern reconstructions describe Posca as tart, sour, and aggressively acidic, more like a diluted shrub syrup than wine. Soldiers drank it not for pleasure but for survival, and they drank it by the gallon. From the foggy forts of Britannia to the desert outposts of Arabia Petrea, Posca was the great equalizer of the Roman military. Archaeological amphora stamps found at Vindolanda confirm Posca rationing as far north as the Hadrianic frontier. Historians estimate that waterborne disease killed more Roman soldiers than enemy weapons. Posca's acetic acid reduced bacterial load by up to 99.9%, making it not just a drink, but a public health intervention 2 millennia ahead of its time. Posca recipes varied by region and regiment. Some legions added mint, fennel, or crushed juniper berries to the vinegar water mix, turning a harsh survival drink into a palatable herbal infusion with mild antiseptic properties. Posca didn't vanish with Rome. The drink persisted throughout the Middle Ages as a peasant staple across Europe, and modern historians like Adrian Goldsworthy have called it the most democratic beverage in human history. The pH of Posca typically ranged between 2.5 and 3.5, far too acidic for most waterborne pathogens to survive. This simple chemistry, unknowingly mastered by Roman quartermasters, gave the legions a biological advantage over every ancient army. Posca was the intersection of chemistry, logistics, and survival, a drink that turned the waste product of winemaking into the lifeblood of the greatest military machine the ancient world ever knew. Without it, Rome might not have held together. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, Posca didn't die with it. The drink survived in peasant cultures across Europe for another 1,000 years, a humble vinegar beverage that outlasted the empire that made it immortal. By 200 BC, Roman legions marching through the Second Punic War drank Posca, watered vinegar, while senators sipped imported Falernian at 5 denarii a jug. Posca was brutally simple: 1 part acetum, leftover wine vinegar, to 3 parts water, sometimes flavored with chopped herbs, or a splash of garum for the desperate. In 50 BC, a premium wine could cost 1,000 denarii. A legionary earned roughly 225 denarii yearly. Posca wasn't choice. It was economic survival disguised as discipline. Julius Caesar noted in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico that his troops relied on Posca during the grueling siege of Alesia in 52 BC, 150,000 Romans against Vercingetorix's forces. All four Gospels record the moment. Roman soldiers offered Jesus Posca on a hyssop sprig at his crucifixion. Matthew 27 verse 48, Mark 15 verse 36, Luke 23 verse 36, and John 19 verse 29 each preserve this grim detail. Philosopher Seneca the Younger, writing around 65 AD, mocked Posca drinkers as those who water their shame, revealing how elite Romans viewed the soldier's staple with open contempt. Plutarch recorded that even Spartan soldiers, famed for their black broth, preferred Posca, the sharp vinegar cutting through the taste of stale bread and despair on campaign. A military diploma from 106 AD, issued under Emperor Trajan, lists rations for a cohort stationed in Dacia. Posca appears alongside grain, salt, and olive oil as standard issue. During Germanicus's campaigns in the Teutoburg forest after the 9 AD disaster, Tacitus wrote that Posca kept legions alive through winter marches where wine would have frozen solid in its skin. Posca was more than drink, it was edible discipline. The sharp acidity killed bacteria in stagnant water, preventing dysentery, the true killer of ancient armies far from clean rivers. The equites, the wealthy equestrian class who filled officer ranks, drank proper wine. A centurion in 1st century Pompeii could afford 200 denarii annually in wine alone, nearly a year's pay for a legionary. The poet Martial, writing in Rome around 86 AD, mocked his impoverished friend with the line, "You drink Posca? I drink Opimian," referring to the legendary wine that cost 10,000 denarii a container. When Claudius invaded Britain in 43 AD, each legionary carried enough Posca for 3 days, roughly 1.5 liters per man, before resupply from the fleet brought more vinegar skins from Gaul. The ultimate irony, the man crucified between thieves was offered Posca, the drink of the lowest Roman, making sour wine the only liquid to touch his lips in his final hours. During the Antonine Plague around 165 AD, records from the legion at Carnuntum show Posca rations doubled. Vinegar's antiseptic properties were invoked as a desperate measure. New recruits in the imperial era swore their sacramentum oath not just to the emperor, but to the discipline Posca represented, a liquid vow of endurance over comfort. By 476 AD, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Roman emperor in the West, Posca had become a cultural memory. The barbarian king's own troops drank ale instead. Early church fathers like Tertullian, writing around 200 AD, reframed Posca from soldiers' torment to Christian metaphor. The sour wine on the cross became the bitter cup Christ chose to drink. Historian Mary Beard argues in SBQR that Posca was the true taste of Rome, not the imported luxury wines of the elite, but the sharp, honest vinegar that built and sustained an empire across 3 continents. 2,000 years later, when we taste the sharp tang of modern balsamic or the sour bite of a cheap vinegar, we are tasting the same discipline that held the Roman world together, Posca, the drink that built an empire. By 284 AD, Emperor Diocletian's reforms couldn't stop the rot. The legions were now staffed by Germanic foederati, who preferred ale to Posca. The legionary system that had produced Posca for 500 years collapsed. By 476 AD, when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the military supply chains that kept Posca flowing were gone forever. With the fall of centralized Rome, the Mediterranean trade networks that moved vinegar, grain, and wine barrels collapsed. Posca ingredients became luxuries that ordinary people could no longer afford. As the empire fractured, Posca didn't vanish overnight. It survived as a peasant beverage in rural Gaul and Hispania, where monks kept the vinegar-making tradition alive in monastery cellars through the 500s and 600s AD. For nearly 1,000 years, Posca faded from written record. Medieval chroniclers mentioned vinegar water for laborers, but the name itself disappeared from documents between the 700s and 1400s AD. Yet the word Posca survived in fragments. In Old French, Posca evolved into posse, meaning weak wine. In Spanish, Posca appeared in 12th century medical texts as a remedy for fever. In 1911, classical scholar Sir Thomas Hodgkin published a groundbreaking paper tracing Posca through medieval texts, arguing it was the drink of the common Roman that sustained legions from Britain to Mesopotamia. In 2018, historian Dr. James Palmer and the Roman Fund Project at the University of Nottingham began systematically reconstructing Posca recipes from ancient sources including Apicius, Cato's De Agricultura, and Vegetius. The reconstructed Posca tasted nothing like modern wine. Panel testers described it as aggressive vinegar water with a wine ghost, sour, tart, and intensely refreshing, exactly what you'd want after a day in armor. By 2023, craft vinegar beverages inspired by Posca appeared in London, Portland, and Melbourne. Companies like Roman Vinegar Company and the Posca Project began selling small batch versions to historically curious consumers. Historians now understand why Posca was essential. The vinegar killed bacteria in stale water, the dilution provided hydration without intoxication, and the slight alcohol content replaced electrolytes lost during marching. The New Testament records that Jesus was offered Posca on the cross. Matthew 27 verse 48 describes a sponge soaked in oxos, the Greek word for vinegar water, raised to Christ's lips, making Posca one of Christianity's most sacred beverages. Modern historians like Adrian Goldsworthy and Mary Beard argue that Posca was not just a soldier's drink, but a tool of empire. It allowed Rome to station legions in water-scarce deserts from Palmyra to Hadrian's Wall. The Western Roman Empire fell in just 75 years between 395 and 470 AD. Within 2 generations, the Posca supply chains that had sustained Rome for 6 centuries were reduced to scattered village recipes. When Posca disappeared, we lost more than a drink. We lost a model of sustainable hydration, a beverage made from waste wine, water, and vinegar that required nothing but ingenuity and discipline. Modern food scientists note that Posca was the ultimate zero-waste drink. Sour wine turned to vinegar, diluted with whatever water was available, consumed by the millions daily without straining resources. At its peak under Trajan in 117 AD, the Roman army numbered 450,000 soldiers across 30 legions. If each drank 2 cups of Posca daily, that's 900,000 cups every single day, a demand that shaped agriculture from Spain to Syria. Today, a growing community of historical enthusiasts, craft brewers, and Roman reenactors keep Posca alive. From the Society of Ancient Gastronomy to independent vinegar makers in Italy, the drink is being reclaimed. The last recorded reference to Posca as a military ration appears in the Strategicon of Emperor Maurice, written around 600 AD in Constantinople. Within a century, the drink that built an empire would be forgotten by everyone except monks and scholars. Posca's story teaches us that civilization is held together not by grand monuments, but by ordinary things. A cup of sour wine, a disciplined routine, the willingness to make something useful from what you have. The last toast of Rome is still being drunk today.